Racist judge finds black woman, then learns she's a federal prosecutor. Ebony Johnson had faced plenty of tough courtrooms in her career, but nothing quite like this. She wasn't here as a federal prosecutor today, just another citizen contesting a routine traffic ticket. At least, that's what she thought. But the moment she stepped into that small-town courtroom, she could feel it. The tension, the quiet stares, the weight of something bigger than a simple fine. Then Judge Wilcox entered, and Ebony realized this was never just about a stop sign. It was about power, about control, and before the gavel fell, she knew one thing for certain: this fight was far from over. Maple Falls was the kind of place where passers-by greeted each other on the street, where teachers and shopkeepers recognized the children by name, where old folks sat on benches feeding pigeons as they discussed local gossip. But Ebony, a keen observer by profession, sensed the veneer of courtesy was not extended equally to everyone. Her presence, a tall, poised black woman in a crisp navy pantsuit, was met with a range of looks. Some were merely curious, others were polite. A few, however, held unease, surprise, or even suspicion. She grabbed a coffee at the Maple Falls Cafe before heading to the courthouse. The barista was friendly enough, offering a cheerful smile, but a pair of elderly patrons at a corner table whispered and cast glances her way. Ebony ignored them, focusing on the taste of the coffee. It was surprisingly good, rich and fresh. Small towns often had hidden treasures. Outside, the midday sun illuminated the row of quaint shops and businesses. She strode confidently toward the courthouse, a stately building with white columns at the entrance. Engraved above the door were the words, "Justice for All," though the engraved letters were chipped and faded with time. Walking through the entrance, Ebony passed through a metal detector. A bored security guard flipped through her purse, eyebrows rising at the professional notepad and legal references. She offered a polite smile. He cleared his throat and waved her on. She walked into the main foyer, a large hall with dark wooden panels on the walls and green marble floors. Large windows let in streams of light, giving the place a venerable, almost cathedral-like aura. Her footsteps echoed in the hallway as she followed signs for traffic court, room 2B. She had at least 40 minutes before her hearing. In Ebony's experience, waiting often felt more draining than the actual legal proceeding. Still, she had prepared a succinct argument to challenge the citation. The officer, in her view, either did not see properly or had singled her out for reasons unrelated to the law. Outside room 2B, a handful of people were already waiting. A middle-aged woman with worry lines etched onto her face, a young man wearing a mechanic's uniform, and a teenage girl accompanied by her father. Ebony took a seat on a stiff wooden bench and began reviewing her notes quietly. She overheard snatches of conversation, complaints about the judge's reputation, rumors that he was strict or no-nonsense. One voice, however, cut through the low murmurs. "Judge Wilcox, you bet he's strict," one older man in wrinkled khakis whispered to his neighbor. "He doesn't suffer fools. But I heard tell he favors some folks, if you catch my drift." The neighbor, a stocky woman with a grocery store vest, nodded knowingly. "I've seen it. It's not just he's tough. He's got his biases. He's from that old guard, if you know what I mean." Ebony frowned. She wanted to believe that, in the year 2025, such blatant partiality on the bench was on its way out. But some corners of America still resisted progress. She shook off the sense of dread settling in her gut. Even if the judge was old-fashioned or harsh, Ebony knew the law. She had faith that a solid legal argument would prevail. She glanced around at the corridor. On the wall, a brass plaque read, "Maple Falls Municipal Court, established 1895. Beneath it hung the pictures of various judges who had presided over the local court through the decades. The largest photograph at the far end displayed Judge Norman Wilcox, a tall, lean man with slicked-back silver hair and sharp blue eyes. His smile looked more like a sneer, Ebony thought. She didn't let it rattle her confidence. She had stood against far worse in her time prosecuting criminals in federal court. When the bailiff finally opened the doors to courtroom 2B, Ebony followed the small crowd inside. The room was unremarkable. Wooden pew-like seats for defendants and observers, a worn carpet, flags in the corner representing the United States and the state, and a raised bench where Judge Wilcox presided. The judge himself was not yet in view. A tired-looking clerk guided everyone to take their seats. Ebony sat on the left side, near the aisle, and quietly observed the environment. Directly across from the judge's bench, a portrait of Lady Justice hung on the wall, the blindfold overshadowing half her face. The morning sun pierced through tall windows, illuminating dust motes in the air and casting elongated shadows of the benches. Two uniformed officers stood at the back, arms folded, scanning the crowd. Ebony's eyes flicked to them momentarily before returning to her notes. A side door opened, and Judge Wilcox walked in. He wore a black robe that seemed a size too big, giving his slender frame a hint of frailty. Yet his demeanor radiated confidence that bordered on arrogance. He took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and surveyed the room. Ebony could practically feel his gaze flick over her, lingering just long enough to convey a sense of scrutiny. "All rise," the bailiff called, and the room stood. After everyone was seated, the judge began calling cases one by one. The first defendant was the teenage girl Ebony had seen outside. She was cited for skateboarding on a roadway. Trembling, she explained her side of the story, that she hadn't seen a "no skateboarding" sign. Judge Wilcox stared at her sternly. "Young lady, ignorance of the law is no defense," he intoned. Then he looked at the father. "If you don't teach your daughter to follow local ordinances, you can expect more serious consequences down the line." He fined the girl $200, a sum which visibly shocked father and daughter. Ebony frowned. That was steep for a small infraction. Then came the middle-aged woman, who pleaded that she needed more time to pay an outstanding parking ticket due to financial hardship. The judge gave her no quarter, demanding the full sum within 30 days, or a warrant would be issued. The woman left the stand, eyes filled with tears. On and on it went. Ebony felt a tight coil form in her stomach as she watched Judge Wilcox mete out harsh sentences and fines. This didn't feel like a quest for justice. It felt like a performance of dominance. She noticed that each time a white defendant came up, the judge's approach would soften just a touch, his voice less curt, his scolding not as pointed. In contrast, whenever a person of color or someone from a lower economic background appeared before him, he unleashed sarcasm or outright contempt. Finally, Ebony's name was called Ebony L. Johnson. She stood, smoothing her pantsuit before stepping to the front. The bailiff directed her to the podium. Judge Wilcox peered down from the bench, arching a brow at her. His voice echoed through the microphone. "Miss Johnson, you're here contesting a traffic citation for failure to stop at a posted stop sign. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Ebony replied calmly. She saw the judge's lips twitch slightly, as if suppressing an unkind remark. "Well, Miss Johnson, I read the officer's statement. You allegedly did not come to a complete halt. The citation says you barely slowed before proceeding through the intersection." Ebony took a breath. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I believe the officer made a mistake. I stopped fully." "How can you be so certain?" The judge cut in, adjusting his glasses. "Officers are trained to observe these infractions clearly." Ebony's jaw tightened. She knew it was pointless to mention her own profession at this juncture. She wanted to present her case like any private citizen. "I'm certain, because I was very cautious. It was at night and visibility was limited. I drive carefully under those conditions. I also have no prior moving violations." "Is that so?" Judge Wilcox drummed his fingers on the desk. "Let's see if your record confirms that." The clerk typed into a computer, then nodded. "No prior record, Your Honor." He made a low, unimpressed hum. "Now, Missy Johnson, the officer wrote a very thorough note here. He claims you performed what's colloquially known as a rolling stop. That's quite common among drivers who think they can outsmart traffic laws." Are you calling this officer a liar, Mrs. Johnson? Ebony swallowed her rising frustration. She recalled how the officer's stare had burned into her, how he'd looked almost too delighted to hand her a ticket. No, Your Honor, I'm not calling anyone a liar. I'm simply stating that he might have misjudged. The judge waved a hand, dismissing her explanation. I've heard enough. You had your chance to state your side. My ruling is final. A wave of murmurs passed through the courtroom. Ebony's mind raced. She hadn't even been allowed to finish her argument. Everything about this felt wrong, from the judge's dismissive tone to the scornful way he eyed her. Your Honor, with respect, if I may present my— He cut her off with a cold stare, raising his voice. You may not. I don't need to hear any more flimsy excuses. I'm finding you guilty of the traffic offences charged. The fine for this citation is $350 plus court costs. Ebony's eyes widened. $350 for a first offence. This is my court, Miss Johnson, the judge snapped. I decide the fine. Pay your dues or face further penalties. That is all. He rapped his gavel, signalling the end of the matter. There was no chance to present witnesses or evidence. Ebony knew she could appeal, but the process would be time-consuming. She was furious, not only for herself, but for everyone who had to face this man under less favorable circumstances and with fewer resources. She glanced at him one last time, noticing a flicker of something akin to pleasure in his eyes, as though he relished showing her that her arguments held no weight in his domain. She had been in enough courtrooms to see that something was seriously amiss here. Judge Wilcox's prejudice wasn't just personal, it was systemic. And Ebony, who had devoted her career to upholding justice, was not about to let it slide. Outside the courtroom, Ebony's heart pounded with a mixture of anger and indignation. She stood in the foyer, gathering her composure as others gave her sympathetic looks. A few muttered about how the judge was unfair. The older man who had spoken earlier in the hallway approached her tentatively. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I saw how the judge treated you in there. It was wrong. I'm sorry." Ebony offered a tight smile. "I appreciate the sentiment." She walked out of the courthouse onto the broad steps that led down to the street. Standing there in the afternoon sun, Ebony pulled out her phone, intending to pay the fine online if possible, just to get it over with. But her hands trembled with lingering adrenaline. Something in her told her that letting this pass unnoticed would be a betrayal of everything she stood for. Just then, a voice behind her spoke. "Ms. Johnson, do you have a moment?" Ebony turned to see a woman in her early 30s with short, curly hair and a warm but worried expression. She extended a hand. "I'm Terry Henson, reporter for the Maple Falls Gazette. I was in the courtroom today covering a different case. I couldn't help noticing what happened. That was something else." Ebony paused, caution coloring her voice. She didn't want to air her grievances in a way that might seem self-serving. "I'm not sure it's newsworthy, Mrs. Henson. Please call me Terry," the reporter replied, glancing around. "Judge Wilcox has a reputation for being tough, but I've been hearing more and more stories of potential bias. People are scared to come forward. You looked prepared in there, and you still got shut down hard. I'd love to hear your thoughts, maybe off the record for now." Ebony sized up Terry. The reporter's sincerity seemed genuine. "I appreciate that, Terry, but I'm not local. I don't want to speak out of turn." "I understand," Terry said, "but if you have any comment—" Ebony considered her options. Press coverage might help spotlight Wilcox's behavior, but Ebony also wanted to handle this in a systematic legal way, possibly by filing a judicial complaint. That process, however, was often lengthy. Sometimes a bit of public scrutiny could accelerate the wheels of accountability. "All I can say is that from where I stood, the proceedings seemed dismissive of my right to present a defense," Ebony said carefully. "I'm sure I'm not the only one who feels that way." Terry nodded, scribbling notes. "Would you be willing to do a sit-down interview if I gather more data? I'd like to compile multiple experiences." Ebony gave a half smile. "Perhaps contact me if you think it will do some good." They exchanged contact details. Ebony felt a heaviness in her chest as she walked away, heading toward the small bus station that would take her back to the train. She had to return to Chicago that same day to deal with a federal case. A sense of unfinished business gnawed at her. Judge Wilcox's demeanor wasn't just unprofessional, it was dangerous. How many people had he wrongfully penalized or intimidated? Back in Chicago, Ebony tried to focus on her work at the Dirksen Federal Building. She was in the midst of a high-profile civil rights case involving alleged police misconduct in a different county. Yet, her thoughts kept drifting back to Maple Falls. Late that evening, after finishing her day in court, she began searching online for any references to Judge Norman Wilcox. What she found both intrigued and alarmed her. There were articles from local newspapers mentioning complaints lodged by defendants against Wilcox, but none seemed to gain much traction. A few described the judge as a traditionalist, defending him for maintaining order in his courtroom. Others questioned the fairness of his harsh sentences, particularly toward minorities. Ebony stumbled upon a short editorial hinting that Wilcox had family ties in Maple Falls stretching back generations, giving him a kind of untouchable status in the local political machine. Most disturbing was a mention in a buried blog post from a few years back. It suggested that Wilcox had thrown out evidence in a police brutality case, citing procedural technicalities. The short piece implied that Wilcox had personal friendships with members of the Maple Falls Police Department. Ebony spent the next hour scribbling notes, cross-referencing cases, trying to ascertain a pattern. By midnight, she had enough to suspect Judge Wilcox was, at minimum, skirting ethical lines, and perhaps outright violating them. As a federal prosecutor specializing in civil rights, Ebony was well versed in what it took to build a case against a judge. It wasn't easy. The judiciary had layers of protection, and the burden of proof was high. But it wasn't impossible. She leaned back in her office chair, eyes shut in fatigue. A memory flashed in her mind. Wilcox's sneer as he dismissed her defense. She recalled the looks of fear and resignation on the faces of other defendants in that courtroom. Ebony knew she couldn't let it go. A week later, Ebony found herself rummaging through archived court records in the Maple Falls County Clerk's office. She had decided to take a personal day off from her Chicago work, sacrificing a precious weekend to drive back down. A discreet conversation with her boss had yielded a green light to look into the matter, though Ebony knew she had to tread carefully. Officially, she was still just Ebony Johnson citizen. Unofficially, she was digging into possible corruption by a sitting judge. In the musty air of the records room, Ebony pored over file after file of traffic and misdemeanor cases presided over by Judge Wilcox. Some patterns were obvious: extraordinary fines, dismissals of defendant testimonies, unsubstantiated reliance on police statements. Most telling was the pattern of sentencing disparities along racial lines. Ebony meticulously compiled a spreadsheet, each case represented by lines of scrawled notes and copies of court documents. Halfway through the morning, Terry Henson showed up as promised. She had local knowledge and connections that might help Ebony find more than just paper records. Together they whispered their findings, cautious not to alert the clerk on duty. "These cases are suspicious," Terry muttered, flipping through a thick file. "People of color are fined at higher rates, often with minimal due process." Ebony nodded. "It's consistent with everything I've seen, but we need more. If we're going to expose this, or if I decide to elevate it to a formal complaint, maybe even a federal investigation, we need solid proof, beyond just sentencing patterns." Terry looked up. "I have a couple of potential sources, people who've gone through Judge Wilcox's court. They might be willing to talk." "That's good," Ebony said. "Let's see if we can get them to sign affidavits, or at least agree to share their testimonies. It has to be more than rumor. We need documented patterns." Hours passed. Ebony's back ached from hunching over the desk. Yet she felt a surge of resolve. This was the kind of justice she had dedicated her career to, fighting systemic abuses that, while not always as overt as some might think, were just as damaging. When they finally emerged into the afternoon light, Ebony and Terry parted ways. Terry would head to the Gazette office to draft a preliminary report. Ebony decided to swing by the Maple Falls Police Department to see if she could speak with the officer who issued her ticket. She also wanted to sense the culture of the department. Was it complicit in Wilcox's questionable rulings? The station was a modest brick building with a single squad car parked out front. The foyer was cramped, and Ebony approached the reception desk, where a disinterested officer in uniform asked if she needed assistance. "Good afternoon," Ebony began. "I'd like to speak with Officer Price if he's on duty." The officer glanced at her skeptically. "What's this about?" Ebony kept her composure. "It's regarding a citation he wrote a few weeks ago." He rolled his eyes. "You want to file a complaint?" She forced a polite smile. "Not exactly, but I do have some questions." The officer shrugged, went into a back room and returned moments later. "He'll be out in a minute." When Officer Price stepped forward, Ebony recognized him immediately. Tall, broad-shouldered, the same unwelcoming gaze. He had the faint scowl of someone who did not want to revisit old business. "Ms. Johnson, right?" His tone was clipped. "You here to pay the fine?" "I've already paid it," Ebony replied, carefully measuring her words. "I just wanted to ask if you remember anything unusual about the stop, for instance, the lighting conditions or other factors." He folded his arms across his chest. "Ma'am, I gave you that ticket because you didn't stop. End of story. If you had an issue, you should have taken it up with the court." "I did, and as you know, Judge Wilcox upheld your citation. I was curious about your observation vantage point. How far were you from the intersection?" A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. "I was parked where I always park. That's official business. I don't have to explain my vantage point to you." Ebony nodded, attempting a conciliatory tone. "I see. Well, thank you for your time, Officer Price." She turned to leave, but he spoke one last time. "Just so you know, Ms. Johnson, we take pride in our town. Outsiders stirring up trouble rarely find themselves welcome." Ebony paused in mid-stride, her pulse quickening. The words lingered like a threat. Without responding, she walked out. The tension in the air was palpable. The Maple Falls Police Department was obviously loyal to Wilcox, or at least to their own insular ways. Back in Chicago the following week, Ebony's personal investigation intensified. She tapped into her professional network discreetly, pulling strings here and there to see if there were any known complaints in the Department of Justice archives about Maple Falls or Judge Wilcox. There were no direct hits. Still, Ebony suspected that small-town politics often escaped federal notice unless a big scandal erupted. Meanwhile, Ebony's workload at the U.S. Attorney's Office remained heavy. She was working on an indictment against a suburban police officer accused of using excessive force, a case that demanded significant time and focus. Yet she couldn't shake her concern about Maple Falls. She read and reread the judicial ethics guidelines, memorizing the steps for lodging a formal complaint against a judge. She knew that if she came forward as a private citizen who was also a federal prosecutor, it could escalate the matter quickly. She'd also risk turning it into a personal vendetta in the public's eyes. One evening, Ebony's phone buzzed as she was locking up her office. It was Terry Henson. She sounded breathless, excited. "Ebony, I've got someone who's willing to talk, an ex-court clerk who worked under Wilcox. She claims to have seen questionable practices, instructions to bury certain complaints, tamper with transcripts. This could be huge." Ebony's heart soared. That might be enough for a formal investigation. But we have to handle this properly. I'll talk to her under the condition that I can use it as part of a potential judicial complaint. She'll need to sign an affidavit. That weekend, Ebony drove back out to Maple Falls. She was growing familiar with the small-town architecture, the hush of the streets after dusk. She met Terry at a discreet diner on the outskirts of town. The place, named Mabel's Eatery, a real location known locally for its pies, was nearly empty. Over cups of coffee, Ebony and Terry waited in a corner booth. When the ex-court clerk arrived, Ebony immediately recognized fear in the woman's posture. She wore a hooded jacket, her gaze flitting nervously around the diner. Terry introduced her as Alexis Ramirez, a soft-spoken woman in her late 20s, with tired eyes and a weighty expression of worry. "I don't want trouble," Alexis began, voice trembling, "but I can't stay silent anymore. I saw what Wilcox did to you, and I remember so many times he did it to others." Ebony nodded gently. "We appreciate your courage in coming forward. Could you describe some of the practices you witnessed?" Alexis twisted her hands together. He would hold these private meetings with certain officers and attorneys before hearings. It was basically a chance for them to make deals, like he'd fine or even jail certain people they didn't like. And if the defendant challenged anything, Wilcox would side with the officer. He told me once, "If you see any motions or complaints against me, you make sure they go missing, or I'll have your job." Terry scribbled rapidly. Ebony leaned forward, her mind swirling. "That's a serious allegation. You're saying he manipulated official records to ensure no complaint reached higher authorities?" Alexis nodded, tears in her eyes. "He had me do it. I feel horrible. I was afraid. He's powerful in this town, you don't understand. Everyone says his father was a well-known judge too, and the whole Wilcox family basically owns Maple Falls." Ebony placed a comforting hand on Alexis's arm. "I do understand the pressure, but we can't let this continue. Would you be willing to make a recorded statement or sign an affidavit? We could then begin official proceedings, and I could notify the relevant federal authorities to open an inquiry." Alexis trembled. "You really think they can take him down? He's untouchable." Ebony took a breath. "Nobody's truly untouchable under the law. If we have enough evidence, and if you're willing, yes, we can hold him accountable." A long silence followed, filled only by the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant clatter of dishes in the kitchen. Finally, Alexis wiped her eyes and nodded. "I'll do it, but I need protection." Terry placed a reassuring hand on Alexis's shoulder. "We'll get you the support you need. I can help coordinate." Ebony felt the weight of responsibility and possibility merging. This was bigger than a single ticket or a personal vendetta. This was about a corrupt system that was failing people every day. Armed with Alexis's statement, Ebony carefully drafted a detailed complaint. She laid out the timeline, referencing Maple Falls case files, testimonies from people Terry had interviewed, and Alexis's insider account. She added her own experience as Ebony Johnson, a private citizen, acknowledging that she was also an assistant U.S. attorney, though clarifying that she was filing this complaint in a private capacity. She made it clear that the evidence suggested potential criminal wrongdoing and gross judicial misconduct. She sent the complaint to the appropriate Judicial Ethics Committee for the state, with a copy to the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. Ebony understood that investigations involving sitting judges could be slow, but the weight of Alexis's testimony provided a strong impetus. Despite her attempts to keep it low-key, word leaked out. Terry's upcoming exposé was set to publish in the Maple Falls Gazette. Residents began gossiping that Ebony Johnson wasn't just a random defendant. She was a high-powered federal prosecutor who might be trying to destroy their beloved judge. Lines were drawn. Some in the community had long felt oppressed by Wilcox's heavy hand and cheered Ebony on quietly. Others, especially those loyal to the judge's old guard lineage, viewed Ebony's actions as an attack on their town. The tension reached a boiling point the day Terry's article went live. It was front-page news in Maple Falls. Former court clerk accuses Judge Wilcox of record tampering. Federal prosecutor files complaint. Ebony read the online edition from her Chicago apartment, feeling a mix of triumph and apprehension. Messages flooded Terry's phone, some supportive, others threatening. Ebony also received hateful emails, some laced with racist invective, telling her to stay out of Maple Falls. She reported the more serious threats to her superiors, who ensured Ebony had increased security measures in place. Sure enough, as Ebony arrived at her office, her boss, U.S. Attorney Glenn Hastings, called her in. His expression was serious. "Ebony, I've reviewed your complaint," Hastings said, leaning back in his chair. "Frankly, I'm impressed with how thorough it is, but you should be aware that you've rattled a hornet's nest." Ebony nodded. "I'm prepared for backlash, but this is too important to ignore." "Agreed. The Department of Justice is considering opening a formal investigation. This means you might be asked to recuse yourself from certain aspects, given your personal involvement. However, your expertise in civil rights is invaluable, so we might keep you on in an advisory capacity. Is that acceptable to you?" "Yes, absolutely," Ebony replied. "I understand the conflict of interest concerns." "Good. Expect phone calls and depositions. Also, watch your back, Ebony. We can't rule out that local authorities in Maple Falls might try to intimidate you or the witnesses." Ebony left the meeting with a renewed sense of purpose. The wheels of justice were starting to turn. It might take time, but she felt confident that a measure of accountability was finally on the horizon. A few days later, Ebony traveled to Maple Falls again for a meeting with DOJ officials who had set up temporary headquarters in a nearby city. They wanted to interview Alexis and a few other key witnesses. Ebony arrived early, staying at a small hotel under her own name, something that in retrospect she would question. That night, in her room, Ebony mulled over the upcoming interviews. This was the biggest push yet to bring Wilcox to justice. Suddenly, the phone in her room rang. She answered, expecting it might be Terry or a DOJ colleague confirming details. But an unfamiliar voice on the other end spat out vile slurs and threats. Ebony's skin crawled as she heard them vow that if she didn't drop this case, she would regret ever setting foot in Maple Falls. She slammed the phone down. Shaken but resolute, Ebony immediately called the front desk to request a room change. She also contacted Terry, who insisted Ebony stay with her at her apartment for the night. Ebony agreed. She had faced threats before in her career, but these felt personal and dangerous. Early the next morning, Ebony woke in Terry's cramped but cozy apartment. Sunlight streamed through thin curtains, illuminating dust motes in the air. Despite the tension, there was a sense of small relief. Ebony wasn't alone in this fight. Over breakfast, Terry scrolled through social media, reading out loud hateful comments from local community pages. There were also supportive messages from people who felt emboldened by Ebony's stand. "This is dividing the whole town," Terry muttered, passing Ebony the phone. "Judge Wilcox's supporters claim you're an outsider stirring up trouble, while those who've suffered under him are relieved you're here." Ebony shook her head. "I'm not surprised. Big upheavals often spark this kind of backlash." Terry offered a small smile. "Well, know that you have allies here, Ebony, no matter what." That afternoon, Ebony accompanied Alexis to the temporary DOJ office in the neighboring city of Redbury. A stout building with minimal architectural flair, it housed a few unmarked federal offices. In a dimly lit conference room, Ebony and two federal investigators took Alexis's deposition. Ebony observed from the side, offering clarifications when needed. Despite her nerves, Alexis spoke courageously, recounting how Judge Wilcox instructed her to hide or destroy complaints. "It wasn't just about skipping a stop sign or rolling stops," Alexis said, voice quivering. "I saw him ruin lives. People who tried to bring up legitimate defenses or lawsuits against police brutality were railroaded in his courtroom." When the deposition ended, the lead investigator, an older gentleman with kind eyes, thanked Alexis for her bravery. "Ms. Ramirez, your testimony is critical. We'll protect your identity as much as possible, but you may need to testify in court if this goes that far." Alexis swallowed, nodded, and glanced at Ebony. Ebony gave her a reassuring smile. "You're doing the right thing." As they stepped out into the hallway, Ebony's phone buzzed. She answered to find none other than Judge Wilcox's clerk on the other line, sounding anxious. "Ms. Johnson, Judge Wilcox has just sent a subpoena for your personal presence in Maple Falls Court next Wednesday, the clerk said hesitantly. He's reopened your traffic case, claiming there's new evidence that you committed perjury. Ebony almost laughed at the absurdity. Perjury? Over a stop sign? That's outrageous. The clerk's voice trembled. I just do what he says, ma'am. The hearing is at 9 o'clock sharp. If you fail to appear, there could be a bench warrant. Ebony ended the call, her hands shaking with anger. She recognized this as a retaliatory move, a flimsy attempt by Wilcox to threaten her, maybe to intimidate her into dropping her complaint. She relayed the information to Alexis and the investigators. One of the investigators, a woman named Carla Fields, frowned. This is a blatant abuse of his power. I'll notify the State Judicial Commission immediately. Ebony exhaled slowly, a wave of tension coursing through her. Good, let them know I plan to appear, but I'll have legal representation with me. Let's see how Judge Wilcox handles that. The morning of the so-called perjury hearing arrived grey and rainy. Ebony drove into Maple Falls, accompanied by a seasoned defense attorney named Paula Shepard, a colleague from Chicago, who offered her services. Paula was in her early 50s, with silver hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. She had handled complex federal cases and was unafraid of Wilcox's theatrics. Outside the courthouse, a small throng of townspeople and media had gathered, braving the drizzle. Cameramen snapped photos, and a local news crew recorded Ebony's arrival. She walked up the steps with Paula at her side, head held high. Inside, the tension was palpable. Judge Wilcox sat on the bench, jaw set, eyes cold as steel. He rapped his gavel, calling the court to order. The gallery behind Ebony was half filled with onlookers, including Terry, Alexis, and several Maple Falls residents. 2 bailiffs flanked the entrance, watching Ebony intently. Mrs. Johnson, Wilcox began, his voice dripping with feigned civility. I have reason to believe that during your last appearance in this court, you made false statements regarding your adherence to traffic laws. Therefore, I'm compelled to investigate the possibility of perjury. Do you understand these proceedings? Paula cleared her throat. Your Honor, my name is Paula Shepard, and I represent Miss Johnson. We find this summons highly questionable, as there is no evidence of perjury beyond the judge's speculation. Moreover, Miss Johnson was denied a fair opportunity to present her defense in the original hearing. Wilcox's lip curled slightly. I see Miss Johnson has come armed with counsel. However, let the record reflect that this court will not be cowed by any outside influences or big city lawyers. A ripple of unease passed through the room. Ebony kept her expression neutral. She refused to be baited. Officer Price, Wilcox called out, please step forward. The officer who had given Ebony the ticket took the stand, repeating his accusation that Ebony had not stopped. Wilcox asked leading questions, painting Ebony as someone who had brazenly tried to game the system. Then it was Paula's turn to cross-examine. She quickly cornered Officer Price with contradictory statements he had made in prior reports. Officer, in your written report from that night, you mentioned the road was poorly lit. How can you be certain Miss Johnson didn't stop fully if visibility was compromised? He stammered, fumbling for a coherent response. Wilcox interrupted, admonishing Paula for badgering the witness. Paula calmly continued, laying out the inconsistencies until Price was visibly sweating. Ebony watched Wilcox's face turn red. He rapped his gavel sharply. Enough! I will not allow this courtroom to devolve into theatrics. Paula folded her arms. Your Honor, the defense moves to dismiss this hearing as baseless. Officer Price's testimony is contradictory, and there's no evidence to support a perjury claim. A tense silence prevailed. Wilcox glared at Ebony, then at Paula. Motion denied, he spat. I will determine whether there is enough evidence to proceed. In that moment, a ripple of movement at the back of the courtroom caught Ebony's attention. 2 men in suits, federal investigators from the DOJ, entered silently and took seats. Wilcox noticed them too, his scowl deepening. Just then the side door opened, and a court staffer approached Wilcox, whispering in his ear. Whatever the staffer said made the judge's complexion turn from pink to ash. Wilcox looked like a cornered animal. He took a shaky breath and cleared his throat. In light of certain developments, I have decided to recuse myself from this matter. Court is adjourned. The gallery erupted in whispers. Ebony and Paula exchanged baffled looks, while Terry scribbled furiously in a notepad. The bailiff announced that everyone needed to exit the courtroom. Ebony saw the two DOJ investigators approach the bench, quietly conferring with Wilcox. He looked furious and humiliated, his mouth pressed into a thin line. Outside, the media pounced. They shouted questions at Ebony, Terry, Paula. Alexis stood off to the side, trying not to draw attention. Ebony offered a tight-lipped statement. "We have no comment at this time." Once they were safely away from the cameras, Ebony asked Paula, "What just happened?" Paula shook her head in disbelief. It seems someone stepped in, likely the Judicial Commission or the DOJ, and informed him that continuing with this farce could expose him to more charges. Whatever it was, it spooked him. Ebony felt a surge of triumph. If Wilcox recused himself, that means he knows the walls are closing in. Paula gave a slight nod, though her eyes flickered with caution. "Be careful. Desperate men do desperate things." Over the following weeks, the DOJ investigation accelerated. Alexis's testimony, combined with new affidavits from other witnesses and data Ebony had collected, provided a robust case against Judge Wilcox. Officially, Ebony was no longer the lead on the case, but she supplied background information and stood ready to testify if necessary. The tension in Maple Falls soared. Wilcox's supporters claimed he was the victim of a witch hunt, while those who had long feared his courtroom felt a glimmer of hope. Terry's articles continued to peel back layers of the judge's history, his father's legacy, his cozy relationships with local law enforcement, the suspicious financial ties that suggested bribes or kickbacks. Meanwhile, Ebony's own life felt the strain. She received more threatening calls and letters. One evening, she discovered her car's windshield smashed in the parking garage of her Chicago apartment. She reported it, suspecting intimidation tactics, but she wasn't deterred. The day the indictment came down was unseasonably sunny. Ebony was in her office, reviewing files for another case, when her phone buzzed with a text from Terry. "They've indicted him. Federal charges, abuse of power, obstruction of justice, bribery." Ebony's hands trembled around her phone as a wave of relief and vindication washed over her. This was it, the big moment of accountability she had fought for. She dialed Terry, who answered with a mix of excitement and caution in her voice. "It's official," Terry said. "Judge Wilcox was just taken into federal custody. He'll be arraigned in Redbury next week." Ebony felt an exhalation of months of pent-up tension. "Thank you, Terry, for everything. This wouldn't have happened without your reporting." "Nor without your push to file that complaint," Terry replied. "Maple Falls owes you one." A week later, Ebony found herself once more in Redbury. This time she was there as a supportive figure in the federal courthouse, observing the arraignment of Judge Norman Wilcox. The atmosphere was surreal. Here was a man who had once lorded over countless people from his high bench in Maple Falls, now in handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit. He looked gaunt, his slicked-back hair disheveled. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a resentful glare. The federal judge presiding over this hearing read out the charges: conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, bribery, and multiple counts of civil rights violations. Wilcox's attorney tried to claim the charges were politically motivated, but the evidence was substantial. Alexis's testimony, in particular, was devastating. At the reading of each count, Ebony glanced around. She saw families of people once wronged by Wilcox. She saw Terry scribbling notes. She saw Alexis, discreetly tucked into a corner, tears glistening in her eyes. A swirl of conflicting emotions washed over Ebony: sadness that the system had been corrupt for so long, relief that justice was finally taking shape, and a fierce pride in everyone who had dared to stand up to tyranny. Judge Wilcox pled not guilty, but Ebony knew the prosecution's case was solid. He was remanded to custody without bail, deemed a flight risk given his connections and resources. As they led him away, their eyes met for a brief second. Even from across the room, Ebony could sense his impotent rage, but she didn't avert her gaze. She held it, matching it with calm resolve. In the weeks following Wilcox's arraignment, Maple Falls underwent a transformation. Without Wilcox's oppressive reign, the municipal court underwent review. Several of his old rulings were revisited, fines were overturned, and defendants who had been wrongfully penalized found new hope. A temporary judge was assigned, someone from the state's judiciary known for impartiality. Terry's newspaper articles chronicled every step, shining light on community members who shared their stories of injustice. Meanwhile, Alexis found a new job in a nearby town, but she remained a key figure in the unfolding trial against Wilcox. The town itself, once so protective of Wilcox, split between those who clung to old loyalties and those who embraced the prospect of change. Ebony stayed involved as a consultant for the DOJ team. She also received numerous speaking invitations from civil rights groups and legal associations. People wanted to know how she managed to take down a powerful judge. Ebony told them the same thing over and over. "I didn't do this alone. It took a community, the courage of whistleblowers like Alexis, and persistent, thorough legal work." Finally, Ebony returned to Maple Falls for one more hearing, this time to provide formal testimony about her experience in Wilcox's courtroom. She spoke confidently, describing the abrupt way Wilcox had dismissed her arguments and the unusual step of reopening her case to charge her with perjury. Her testimony helped solidify the allegation that Wilcox had used his power to intimidate critics. When she stepped down from the stand, Ebony felt a burden lifting from her shoulders. The hearing concluded, and Ebony stood in the hallway, exhaling a deep breath she felt she'd been holding for months. Paula Shepherd walked up, smiling. "The trial is going well. I expect a conviction on multiple counts." Ebony nodded. "I hope so. Otherwise, that kind of corruption will just seep back into the system." Paula placed a comforting hand on Ebony's shoulder. "You did good, Ebony. The scales of justice might tilt slowly sometimes, but you helped them tilt in the right direction." True to Paula's prediction, a few weeks later, a federal jury found Judge Wilcox guilty on multiple charges: conspiracy, obstruction of justice, bribery, and willful violation of civil rights. The sentencing phase that followed was nothing short of a Shakespearean downfall. Wilcox, once the self-assured arbiter of everyone else's fates, now faced the reality of years behind bars. The presiding federal judge, with unassailable calm, handed down a severe but just sentence: 15 years in federal prison, plus fines and restitution to those wronged. Ebony watched from the gallery as the sentence was read. Wilcox looked hollow, defeated. She wondered if he felt any remorse. She doubted it. He had built an empire of fear, and now it lay in ruins. In the aftermath, Ebony walked out of the courthouse into a sunny afternoon. The glare of the sun felt warm on her face, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of closure. She found Terry waiting on the steps, microphone in hand, camera rolling. "Ebony," Terry called, "would you say justice was served today?" Ebony paused, reflecting. "I'd say it was a step in the right direction. True justice means ensuring that no one, however powerful, can use the law as a weapon of oppression." Terry smiled softly, nodding to the cameraman to stop filming. "And the town? Some are worried about healing. Any advice you'd offer them?" Ebony gazed at the small crowd gathered. A swirl of reporters, Maple Falls locals, onlookers curious about the outcome. She spoke in a voice strong but gentle. "The best way forward is to commit to transparency, accountability, and empathy. This isn't just about one corrupt judge. It's about building a system that genuinely lives up to its promise of justice for all." A few months later, Ebony sat in her Chicago apartment, sifting through a stack of mail. Among the bills and advertisements, she spotted a cream-colored envelope with elegant handwriting. Inside was a letter from a Maple Falls resident, a single mother who thanked Ebony for her stand against Judge Wilcox. The woman wrote that her son had once been unfairly sentenced by Wilcox, and now his record was expunged. The letter ended with, "You changed our lives, Miss Johnson. Because of you, my son has a second chance." Ebony felt her eyes grow misty. She smiled, rereading the words, absorbing the gratitude. It was a reminder that the fight for justice, while grueling, made a difference in real lives. She pinned the letter to her fridge, letting it stand as a testament to the power of speaking out. The phone rang then. It was Terry, calling to update Ebony about new reforms being discussed for the Maple Falls Municipal Court. Ebony listened, a sense of hope lighting her face. She thought back to the day she first entered that small courtroom as a mere traffic defendant. How quickly that had escalated into a battle against entrenched injustice, yet in the end, truth prevailed. As Ebony finished the call, she walked to her window. The city lights of Chicago shimmered in the dusk. She remembered the words engraved above the Maple Falls courthouse, "Justice for all." For so long, those words had been hollow under Wilcox's regime. Now perhaps they held real meaning. And Ebony Johnson was content to have played her part, a single voice that sparked a movement, culminating in hard karma, hitting back on a corrupt system. She closed her eyes, exhaling one last breath of tension. In that moment, Ebony allowed herself the quiet victory of knowing that sometimes, even against all odds, justice can indeed be served.